Sarah Martinez had been working as a humanitarian aid coordinator in Afghanistan for 8 months when her world changed forever on a dusty Tuesday morning in March 2019. The 8-year-old nurse from Phoenix, Arizona, had volunteered with the International Medical Relief Organization to help bring healthcare to remote villages in Kandahar province. What started as a routine medical supply delivery would become one of the most extraordinary survival stories of the modern conflict. The convoy left the base camp at dawn, consisting of 3 armored vehicles carrying medical supplies, food, and a small team of international aid workers. Sarah sat in the middle vehicle alongside Dr. James Fletcher, a British physician, and their Afghan translator, Ahmad. The morning air was crisp, and the landscape stretched endlessly in all directions. Barren hills, dotted with sparse vegetation under an impossibly blue sky. Sarah had grown to love these morning drives despite the inherent dangers. The quiet conversations with her colleagues, the anticipation of reaching another village where they could make a real difference, and even the stark beauty of the Afghan countryside had become precious to her. She kept a small journal where she wrote about her experiences, and that morning she had jotted down her thoughts about a young girl they had treated the previous week for malnutrition. The first vehicle in their convoy was about 200 meters ahead when the world exploded around them. The lead truck hit an improvised explosive device buried in the road, sending a massive plume of dirt and debris into the air. Before anyone could process what was happening, the distinctive crack of automatic weapons fire erupted from the hills on both sides of the narrow valley road. Ahmad immediately started shouting directions to their driver in rapid Pashto, while Dr. Fletcher grabbed the radio to call for backup. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs as bullets began striking their armored vehicle with metallic pings that sounded almost musical in their deadly rhythm. Their driver, an experienced local man named Farid, floored the accelerator in an attempt to escape the kill zone. The ambush had been carefully planned. Insurgents had positioned themselves on elevated ground on both sides of the road, creating a crossfire that made escape nearly impossible. As their vehicle sped forward, Sarah could see muzzle flashes winking from behind rocks and sparse vegetation. The windshield spider-webbed from a direct hit, though the bulletproof glass held. "Everyone stay down!" Dr. Fletcher yelled as he continued trying to raise their security detail on the radio. The static-filled responses were barely audible over the engine noise and continued gunfire. Sarah pressed herself against the floor of the vehicle, her medical training automatically kicking in as she began mentally preparing for potential casualties. Their vehicle made it perhaps another 100 meters before a rocket-propelled grenade struck the engine block. The explosion was deafening, and Sarah felt herself thrown against the interior wall as the truck rolled onto its side and slid down a small embankment. The acrid smell of smoke and burning oil immediately filled the cabin. Dr. Fletcher had taken shrapnel to his left arm and was bleeding heavily. Ahmad appeared unconscious, a trickle of blood running from his forehead. Farid was slumped over the steering wheel, motionless. Sarah, despite being dazed from the impact, immediately began assessing injuries while bullets continued to strike the overturned vehicle. "James, can you hear me?" she called to Dr. Fletcher as she applied pressure to his wound, using supplies from her medical kit. He nodded weakly, his face pale from blood loss. The shooting seemed to be intensifying, and Sarah realized that the insurgents were likely moving closer to their position. Through a cracked window, she could see figures moving down the hillside toward their disabled vehicle. Her hands shook as she tried to stabilize Dr. Fletcher's injury, knowing that they had perhaps minutes before the attackers reached them. The radio was damaged and crackling with static, making communication with their base impossible. The first insurgent reached their vehicle within 10 minutes of the crash. Sarah heard voices speaking in what she assumed was Pashto, followed by the sound of someone trying to force open the rear doors. She made a quick decision that would save her life. She pulled Ahmad's body partially over herself and remained as still as possible, hoping to appear dead or unconscious. When the door was finally pried open, harsh sunlight flooded the interior. Sarah could hear Dr. Fletcher groaning in pain, which immediately drew the attention of their captors. Through barely opened eyes, she watched as several armed men in traditional Afghan clothing entered the vehicle. One of them, who appeared to be their leader, began barking orders while pointing at the survivors. Dr. Fletcher was roughly pulled from the wreckage, despite his injuries. Ahmad, who Sarah now realized was breathing shallowly, was also dragged out. When one of the insurgents grabbed her arm, Sarah remained completely limp, fighting every instinct that told her to resist or cry out. The man checked her pulse at her neck, and Sarah managed to slow her breathing enough to convince him she was either dead or dying. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes, the insurgents made the decision to leave her in the wreckage. She heard their leader say something that she later learned meant, "This one is finished," before they departed with Dr. Fletcher and Ahmad as prisoners. The sound of their footsteps and voices gradually faded as they moved away from the crash site. Sarah remained motionless for another 20 minutes after the last sounds of the insurgents disappeared. Her entire body ached from the crash, and she was becoming aware of a burning pain in her left side that she hadn't noticed during the initial chaos. When she finally dared to move, she discovered that she had been hit by shrapnel in 3 places: her left side, her right shoulder, and her thigh. More concerning was what she found when she carefully examined her injuries in the dim light filtering through the damaged vehicle. The wound in her side was deeper than she had initially thought, and blood was seeping steadily through her torn shirt. She realized with growing horror that she might have been shot during the firefight without even knowing it due to the adrenaline and chaos of the situation. Using her medical training, Sarah began treating her own wounds with the limited supplies available in the overturned vehicle. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was using techniques she had learned to help others to save her own life. She managed to create makeshift bandages from torn clothing and applied pressure to the most serious wounds. As the afternoon heat began to build inside the metal vehicle, Sarah faced a crucial decision. She could remain hidden in the wreckage and hope that rescue teams would eventually find her. Or she could attempt to walk to safety despite her injuries and the possibility that insurgents might still be in the area. The radio was completely dead. Her phone had no signal, and she had no way to communicate with the outside world. The decision was made for her when she heard the distant sound of vehicles approaching. For a moment, her heart leaped with hope that rescue had arrived. But as the sounds grew closer, she realized these were not the heavy engines of military vehicles she was familiar with. Instead, she heard the lighter engines of civilian trucks, and voices calling out in what sounded like the same language the insurgents had been speaking. Sarah's medical training told her that with her current injuries and the heat building inside the metal vehicle, she might not survive another night without proper medical care. But her survival instincts told her that discovery by the wrong people would mean certain death, or worse. She made the difficult decision to remain hidden and hope that proper rescue forces would arrive before her condition deteriorated further. As evening approached and the temperature began to drop, Sarah used the time to more thoroughly assess her situation. She had limited water, just half a bottle, that had survived the crash. Her medical supplies consisted of basic first aid materials from her kit, which she had already largely exhausted treating her wounds. Most seriously, she was beginning to suspect that at least one of her injuries might be infected based on the increased pain and redness around the wound. The night brought new challenges, as temperatures dropped dramatically. The Afghan desert could be brutally cold after sunset, and Sarah found herself shivering uncontrollably despite her efforts to create insulation using seat cushions and anything else she could find in the wreckage. The pain from her injuries made sleep nearly impossible, but exhaustion eventually overcame discomfort. Sarah's dreams that night were filled with the sounds of gunfire and explosions. She relived the ambush repeatedly, wondering if she could have done something differently to help her colleagues. The rational part of her mind knew that she had made the only choices available to her. But guilt and survivor's remorse began to creep into her thoughts as the long night dragged on. When dawn finally broke, Sarah forced herself to eat a small energy bar she found in Dr. Fletcher's belongings. Her water supply was now critically low, and she estimated that even with careful rationing, she had perhaps enough for one more day. The wounds on her side and thigh were definitely showing signs of infection, and she was running a fever that made thinking clearly increasingly difficult. It was during that second morning that Sarah made the discovery that would ultimately save her life. While searching through the debris for anything useful, she found a small emergency beacon that had been thrown from one of the equipment cases during the crash. The device was damaged but still functional, and Sarah realized it might be her only chance of signaling for help. The beacon had limited battery life, perhaps enough for 2 or 3 activation cycles. Sarah knew she would have to time its use carefully to maximize the chances of rescue forces detecting the signal. She decided to activate it during midday, when search and rescue operations would be most active, then save the remaining battery power for one final attempt if the first signal failed to bring help. As she prepared to activate the beacon for the first time, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about her family back in Phoenix, who had worried constantly about her decision to volunteer in Afghanistan. She thought about the patients she had treated in recent months, and the difference she had been able to make in their lives. Most of all, she thought about Dr. Fletcher and Ahmad, hoping they were still alive, and that rescue forces would be able to locate them as well. The beacon's signal went out at exactly noon, sending a brief but powerful distress call that would hopefully reach coalition forces in the area. Sarah then settled in to wait, knowing that help could arrive within hours or might not come at all. Either way, she was determined to survive long enough to tell the world what had happened to her colleagues and to ensure that their sacrifice had not been in vain. The second day brought Sarah face to face with the harsh reality of her situation. Her beacon signal had gone unanswered, and her condition was deteriorating rapidly. The infection in her wounds had spread, causing red streaks to appear on her skin, a dangerous sign that she recognized from her medical training. Her fever had worsened overnight, and she found herself drifting in and out of consciousness. Water had become Sarah's most critical concern. The half bottle she had been carefully rationing was now down to just a few sips, and the desert heat was becoming unbearable inside the metal wreckage. She had tried to collect morning dew on pieces of cloth, but the arid climate yielded almost nothing. Dehydration was setting in, making her already difficult situation nearly impossible. During moments of clarity between fever episodes, Sarah forced herself to continue treating her wounds with the few remaining supplies from her medical kit. She had fashioned a crude irrigation system using a torn water bottle to clean the infected areas. Though without proper antibiotics, she knew it was largely a losing battle. The wound in her side, which she now suspected was indeed a bullet wound, continued to seep blood despite her efforts to control the bleeding. The psychological challenges were becoming as difficult as the physical ones. The isolation was crushing, and Sarah found herself talking aloud to combat the oppressive silence. She recited medical procedures, sang songs her mother had taught her as a child, and even held imaginary conversations with her colleagues. The distinction between reality and fever-induced hallucinations was becoming increasingly blurred. On the afternoon of the second day, Sarah heard helicopters in the distance. Her heart raced as she fumbled for the emergency beacon, activating it for the second time. The battery indicator showed it was nearly depleted, but the signal went out. For agonizing minutes, she listened as the helicopters seemed to circle the area. The sound grew closer, then gradually faded away without any sign that her signal had been detected. The disappointment was devastating. Sarah realized that the wreckage of her vehicle was probably hidden from aerial view by its position at the bottom of the embankment. Even if search teams were looking for survivors, they might easily miss her location from the air. She would need to find a way to make herself more visible or somehow reach higher ground. Movement was becoming increasingly difficult. The infection had spread to the point where Sarah was experiencing chills and rigors, classic signs of sepsis that she knew could be fatal without immediate medical intervention. Her training told her exactly what was happening to her body, which made the situation even more frightening. She was literally watching herself die by degrees. Despite her deteriorating condition, Sarah managed to drag herself partially out of the wreckage that evening. Using a piece of reflective metal from the vehicle's interior, she positioned it to catch the last rays of sunlight, creating a makeshift signal mirror. It wasn't much, but it was the best she could do with her limited strength and resources. The third night was the worst yet. Sarah's fever spiked to dangerous levels, and she began experiencing severe delirium. She found herself reliving traumatic moments from the ambush, but also beautiful memories from her childhood and her work in Afghanistan. In her fevered state, she had long conversations with patients she had treated, her family members, and even Dr. Fletcher and Ahmed, though she knew rationally that they weren't there. During one particularly vivid hallucination, Sarah believed she was back in the hospital in Phoenix, where she had trained, working alongside her mentor, Dr. Elizabeth Hawkins. In the dream, Dr. Hawkins was teaching her advanced trauma procedures, and Sarah found herself reciting the steps for treating gunshot wounds and sepsis. Even in her delirium, her medical training remained intact. When dawn broke on the fourth day, Sarah barely had the strength to open her eyes. Her water was completely gone, and she hadn't been able to eat anything in over 24 hours. The infections had progressed to the point where red streaks were visible running up her arm and leg from the wound sites. She knew with clinical certainty that she was dying. It was then that Sarah heard voices in the distance, not the imagined conversations of her fever dreams, but actual human voices speaking in English with American accents. At first, she thought it might be another hallucination. But as the voices grew closer, she realized that a patrol had somehow found the crash site. "We've got wreckage down here," one of the voices called out. "Looks like it's been here a few days. Check for survivors." Sarah tried to call out, but her voice was barely a whisper. She managed to tap weakly against the metal frame of the vehicle with a piece of debris, creating a faint but audible sound. The tapping was rhythmic, 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, the international distress signal SOS that she remembered from her emergency medical training. The sound of footsteps approaching grew closer. Sarah heard someone say, "Did you hear that?" Sounded like tapping. More voices joined in, and she could tell there were several people now investigating the wreckage. She continued tapping with what little strength she had remaining, praying that someone would hear her signal. "Holy shit! There's someone alive in there!" The voice was clear and close now. Sarah felt tears of relief streaming down her face as she heard the sounds of people working to reach her. Heavy equipment was being brought in to safely extract her from the twisted metal without causing further injury. The extraction took nearly an hour due to the precarious position of the vehicle and Sarah's injuries. Military medics worked carefully to stabilize her condition, while engineers used specialized equipment to create an opening large enough to safely remove her. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness during the process, but she could hear the professional, calm voices of her rescuers as they coordinated her extraction. When Sarah was finally pulled from the wreckage, the sight that greeted the rescue team was shocking. She had lost significant weight, her clothes were torn and blood-stained, and the infected wounds were clearly visible. Her vital signs were dangerously unstable, indicating severe dehydration, blood loss, and systemic infection. The medics immediately began emergency treatment, starting IV fluids and antibiotics while preparing her for medical evacuation. The helicopter ride to the nearest medical facility was a blur of pain and relief. Sarah was conscious enough to understand that she was finally safe, but sick enough that she couldn't fully comprehend what was happening around her. The flight medics worked continuously to stabilize her condition during the transport, monitoring her vital signs and adjusting her treatment based on her body's responses. At the field hospital, Sarah underwent immediate surgery to clean and repair her wounds. The surgeons found that she had indeed been shot twice during the ambush, once in the side and once in the thigh. Fragments from the vehicle explosion had caused additional injuries to her shoulder. The fact that she had survived 4 days with untreated gunshot wounds and developing sepsis was remarkable. The medical team was amazed by Sarah's survival. Dr. Michael Torres, the surgeon who treated her, later commented that her medical training had undoubtedly saved her life. Her ability to properly treat her own wounds, despite limited supplies and deteriorating conditions, had prevented her from bleeding to death or developing even more serious infections. During her recovery at the field hospital, Sarah learned the fate of her colleagues. Dr. Fletcher had been rescued 3 days earlier when coalition forces raided the insurgent camp where he was being held. He had survived his injuries but remained hospitalized with complications from his shrapnel wounds. Ahmad had also been rescued, and was recovering well, though he bore both physical and psychological scars from his captivity. The investigation into the ambush revealed that it had been a coordinated attack specifically targeting humanitarian aid workers. Intelligence gathered during the rescue operations led to the capture of several insurgent cells and the disruption of their network in the region. Sarah's survival and the information she provided about the attack proved valuable in these subsequent operations. News of Sarah's survival spread quickly through both military and civilian channels. Her story became a symbol of resilience and the risks faced by humanitarian workers in conflict zones. Media outlets around the world picked up the story, focusing on her courage during the ordeal and her dedication to helping others even in such dangerous circumstances. Sarah's family flew to Germany, where she was transported for advanced medical care at a military hospital. The reunion was emotional and overwhelming, as they had been told that she was missing and possibly dead for nearly a week. Her parents, Maria and Robert Martinez, had been preparing for the worst when they received the call that their daughter had been found alive. The psychological impact of the ordeal was significant. Sarah experienced symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, including nightmares, anxiety, and depression. She worked with military psychologists and counselors to process her experiences and develop coping strategies. The guilt she felt about surviving when her driver Farid had died weighed heavily on her mind. Physical recovery was lengthy and complicated. The infections required weeks of intensive antibiotic treatment, and the gunshot wounds needed multiple surgical procedures to heal properly. Sarah also had to undergo extensive physical therapy to regain full mobility in her injured shoulder and leg. The medical team was optimistic about her long-term prognosis, but warned that complete recovery would take many months. During her hospitalization, Sarah received thousands of letters and messages from people around the world who had been inspired by her story. Fellow medical professionals, military personnel, and ordinary citizens reached out to express their admiration for her courage and dedication. These messages became an important source of strength during her darkest moments of recovery. Sarah also used her time in the hospital to write detailed reports about the ambush and her survival experience. Military intelligence officers interviewed her extensively about what she had observed and experienced. Her accounts provided valuable information about insurgent tactics and helped improve security protocols for humanitarian operations in the region. The question that haunted Sarah throughout her recovery was whether she would return to humanitarian work after experiencing such trauma. The rational part of her mind recognized the extreme risks involved, but her heart remained committed to helping people in need. She knew that her decision would affect not just her own future, but also serve as an example to other aid workers facing similar choices. As Sarah's physical condition improved, she began to contemplate what the experience had taught her about resilience, survival, and the human capacity to endure unimaginable circumstances. The 4 days in the wreckage had changed her in ways she was still discovering, and she knew that understanding and integrating these changes would be a lifelong process. 6 months after the ambush, Sarah Martinez stood at the window of her apartment in Phoenix, looking out at the familiar landscape of her hometown. The Arizona desert stretched to the horizon, but it looked different to her now than it had before Afghanistan. Every rocky outcrop and distant hill reminded her of that valley, where her world had changed forever. The physical scars from her injuries had healed well, but the invisible wounds were proving more difficult to mend. The transition back to civilian life had been more challenging than Sarah had expected. Simple activities, like grocery shopping or driving through downtown Phoenix, could trigger intense anxiety. The sound of helicopters overhead, which she had never noticed before, now caused her heart to race and her hands to tremble. Crowded places made her feel trapped and vulnerable, constantly scanning for exits and potential threats. Sarah had returned to work at Phoenix General Hospital, but in a limited capacity. The hospital administration had been incredibly supportive, allowing her to ease back into her duties gradually. She started with administrative work and patient consultations, avoiding the emergency department where the chaos and urgency too closely resembled the trauma she had experienced. Her colleagues treated her with a mixture of admiration and careful concern, unsure how to interact with someone who had survived such an extraordinary ordeal. The nightmares came regularly for the first few months. Sarah would wake up, believing she was still trapped in the overturned vehicle, feeling the heat of the metal around her, and tasting the dust in her mouth. Sometimes she dreamed that she was still injured and alone, watching infections spread through her body, while help remained frustratingly out of reach. Other nights, she relived the ambush from different perspectives, imagining alternative scenarios where she could have saved Farid or helped her colleagues escape. Therapy sessions with Dr. Rachel Stevens, a psychologist specializing in trauma recovery, became a crucial part of Sarah's healing process. Dr. Stevens helped her understand that survivor's guilt was a normal response to her experience, and that the intrusive thoughts and anxiety she was experiencing were symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder rather than signs of weakness or failure. Survival changes you, Dr. Stevens explained during one of their sessions. You've seen how quickly life can change, how fragile our sense of security really is. Your mind is working overtime to protect you from experiencing that vulnerability again. It's actually quite normal, even though it feels overwhelming right now. The most difficult aspect of recovery was the constant questioning of her life choices. Sarah found herself wondering whether her work in Afghanistan had been worth the risk, not just to herself but to her family and friends who had worried about her safety. The letters from people around the world who had been inspired by her story helped, but they also added pressure to live up to an image of heroism that she didn't feel she deserved. 3 months into her recovery, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Dr. James Fletcher had flown to Phoenix specifically to see her. His own recovery had been complicated by nerve damage in his left arm, and he walked with a slight limp from injuries sustained during his captivity. But his spirits seemed remarkably good as they sat together in Sarah's living room, sharing tea and carefully avoiding the obvious topics they both needed to discuss. "I've been thinking about going back," Dr. Fletcher said eventually, breaking the careful silence they had maintained about their shared experience. "Not to Afghanistan necessarily, but to humanitarian work. I know it sounds crazy given what happened to us." Sarah looked at him with surprise and something that might have been relief. She had been harboring similar thoughts but had been afraid to voice them, worried that people would think she had learned nothing from her ordeal. "I've been thinking the same thing," she admitted quietly. "I feel like I'm letting down all the people who need help if I stay here in safety." Their conversation that afternoon marked a turning point in Sarah's recovery. For the first time since the ambush, she felt understood by someone who had shared a similar experience. Dr. Fletcher's validation of her continued desire to help others gave her permission to acknowledge feelings she had been suppressing out of fear that they were irrational or self-destructive. Ahmad, their translator, had also survived his captivity and had sent several letters to both Sarah and Dr. Fletcher. His recovery had been complicated by the cultural stigma surrounding his capture and the fact that his family had received threats from sympathizers of his captors. Despite these challenges, his letters expressed gratitude for the medical care they had provided to his village and hoped that their work could continue in some form. The turning point in Sarah's physical recovery came when she decided to return to running, something she had done competitively in college but had abandoned after her injuries. The first time she laced up her running shoes, her hands shook so badly she could barely tie the laces. The simple act of being outdoors and moving felt dangerous and exposed, as if she were making herself a target again. But something about the rhythm of running began to heal parts of her that therapy and medicine couldn't reach. Each step forward felt like a small victory over the trauma that had tried to define her. As her endurance improved, so did her confidence. The physical strength she regained paralleled emotional resilience that she had thought was permanently damaged. Sarah began volunteering with a local organization that provided medical care to homeless populations in Phoenix. The work wasn't in a conflict zone, but it allowed her to use her skills to help vulnerable people who often received inadequate health care. She found that being useful again, making a difference in people's lives, helped quiet some of the restless guilt that had plagued her since the ambush. During this time, Sarah also began writing about her experience. What started as journaling for her own healing gradually evolved into something more substantial. She wrote about the reality of humanitarian work, the dedication of local staff like Farid, who risked their lives to help others, and the complex emotions surrounding survival and recovery. Her writing became a way to honor those who had been lost and to process the profound changes the experience had brought to her worldview. The decision to return to international humanitarian work came gradually rather than as a sudden revelation. Sarah realized that staying safely in Phoenix, while understandable, felt like allowing the insurgents who had attacked them to achieve their goal of stopping medical aid to people who desperately needed it. She began exploring opportunities with organizations that operated in less dangerous regions, looking for ways to continue helping others while managing the realistic concerns about her safety. Dr. Stevens supported this decision, noting that returning to meaningful work often helped trauma survivors reclaim a sense of purpose and control over their lives. However, she emphasized the importance of careful preparation and ongoing psychological support. Healing doesn't mean forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't change you, she explained. It means integrating that experience into who you are now and moving forward with wisdom gained rather than moving backward with fear. She explained. 1. The opportunity that eventually drew Sarah back to international service came through an organization working with Syrian refugees in Jordan. The position involved training local medical staff and helping establish clinics in refugee camps, important work, but in a relatively stable environment with strong security protocols. The role would allow her to use both her medical skills and her hard-won understanding of operating in challenging conditions. Before accepting the position, Sarah traveled to Germany to meet with Dr. Fletcher, who had taken a similar role with a different organization working in refugee camps in Greece. Their reunion was emotional, as both had changed significantly since their last meeting in Phoenix. Dr. Fletcher had regained most of the function in his injured arm and seemed to have found peace with his decision to return to humanitarian work. "We can't let what happened to us stop us from helping people," he said as they walked through the streets of Berlin. "But we can be smarter about how we do it. We can use what we learned to help our organizations improve their security protocols and better protect their staff." Their conversation reinforced Sarah's belief that returning to humanitarian work was not just personally important for her healing, but could also contribute to making such work safer for others. Her experience had taught her valuable lessons about risk assessment, emergency procedures, and survival techniques that could benefit other aid workers operating in dangerous environments. The night before leaving for Jordan, Sarah stood once again at her apartment window in Phoenix, looking out at the desert landscape. But this time, the view didn't fill her with anxiety or painful memories. Instead, she felt a quiet sense of purpose and determination. The young woman who had left for Afghanistan 2 years earlier had been idealistic and somewhat naive about the risks involved in humanitarian work. The person leaving for Jordan was wiser, more careful, but equally committed to helping others. Sarah's family had mixed feelings about her decision to return to international service. They were proud of her resilience and dedication, but naturally worried about her safety. Her mother, Maria, had spent months fearing for her daughter's life and struggling with the decision to support her return to potentially dangerous work. However, she ultimately recognized that preventing Sarah from doing what she felt called to do would cause a different kind of harm. "You're not the same person who left for Afghanistan," her father, Robert, observed during their final dinner together before her departure. "You're stronger in some ways, more careful in others. I trust you to make good decisions about your safety because you've learned what the real consequences can be." The flight to Jordan felt different from her trip to Afghanistan. Sarah was more aware of the risks, more prepared for the challenges she would face, and more realistic about what she could and couldn't control. She had developed better coping strategies for stress and anxiety, and she had learned to recognize the early warning signs of trauma responses that could interfere with her work. Upon arriving in Jordan, Sarah was struck by the resilience of the Syrian refugees she would be working with. Many had survived experiences far worse than her own, losing family members, homes, and entire communities to war. Their determination to rebuild their lives and care for their children despite unimaginable losses put her own struggles into perspective and reminded her why humanitarian work remained important to her. The medical work in the refugee camps was challenging but deeply rewarding. Sarah found that her experience surviving serious injuries with limited medical resources had given her valuable insights into treating patients in resource-constrained environments. She was able to teach local staff practical techniques for managing trauma cases and emergency situations using basic supplies and improvised equipment. More importantly, Sarah's survival story resonated with many of the refugees she worked with. People who had endured their own traumatic experiences found hope in her example of resilience and recovery. She became not just a medical provider but a symbol that it was possible to survive terrible experiences and continue living meaningfully. 6 months into her assignment in Jordan, Sarah received word that Ahmad, their former translator, had been accepted for resettlement in Canada along with his family. The news filled her with joy and relief, knowing that he would finally be safe from the threats that had plagued him since their rescue. He wrote to tell her that he planned to study nursing, inspired by the medical work he had witnessed during their time together in Afghanistan. As Sarah reflected on the journey from that dusty valley in Afghanistan to the refugee camps of Jordan, she realized that survival had been just the beginning of her story. The real challenge had been learning how to live with purpose and meaning after experiencing profound trauma. Her work with Syrian refugees had shown her that healing was possible not just for herself, but for entire communities that had been broken by violence and loss. The scars from her physical wounds had faded to thin white lines that were barely visible unless she pointed them out. The psychological scars were less obvious, but perhaps more permanent, manifesting as a heightened awareness of risks and a deeper appreciation for the fragility of safety and security. These changes weren't entirely negative. They had made her more empathetic to her patients' suffering and more thoughtful about the impact of her work. Sarah's story had become more than just a tale of individual survival. It had evolved into an example of how people could use traumatic experiences as sources of strength and wisdom, rather than allowing them to be solely sources of pain and limitation. Her continued commitment to humanitarian work, despite the risks she had experienced firsthand, sent a powerful message about the importance of not allowing fear to prevent people from helping others in need. Looking toward the future, Sarah knew that her path would continue to be shaped by her experiences in Afghanistan, but it would not be defined by them. She had learned that resilience was not about being unaffected by trauma, but about finding ways to continue growing and contributing despite being changed by difficult experiences. Her survival had given her not just a second chance at life, but a deeper understanding of what made life worth living.